Welcome to Windy Night Stories. Tonight's story has no attribution, by Anonymous. The Carved Mantelpiece of Granton Hall. As for me, said Mrs. Beverly, I am rarely frightened by a ghost story. One knows the stock and trade so well. The unbidden guest at table, the handsome cavalier in the family portrait, who is always appearing at odd moments and frightening his descendants, and the old lady in brocade who haunts the corridor. Well, perhaps so, said her friend, Mrs. Glossop, but they answer their purpose very well in frightening me. I quail before them, brocade, family portrait, and all. I suppose it is with me as with Madame de Stael. I don't believe in them, but am horribly afraid of them. You are quite welcome to laugh at me, my dear, but I never hope to outgrow a shiver over a story like that we have just read, about unexpiated crime leaving something uncanny to the spot of its committal. Nor should I care to have to define the limits of the spiritual world and say what is exactly possible and what is not. No, agreed Mrs. Beverly, after a moment's pause, and I am just thinking whether or not to tell you of a curious thing that came partly under my notice many years ago. It may be explained away in a measure, she added, thoughtfully, and yet it was a strange, uncomfortable kind of thing. As for my nerves, my dear, said her friend, they are already shaken for the night and cannot be made worse. So pray let me hear your strange, uncomfortable kind of thing, to add to a few more of the kind that I have known. If it can be explained away, all the better. But as I always forget the explanation and remember the ghost, it will not be of much use to me. It happened during the first visit I made to my friend Susan Nethersole after her marriage, said Mrs. Beverly, and my arrival preceded that of the heroine of this tale by a few days. Her name was Laura Daventry, and she had, like myself, never been in that house before. My friend Susan seemed very pleased to have me with her, and to show me through Granton Hall, which, as you know, is a very charming place. So the first day was taken up in going over the house and admiring its contents. The marriage engagement having been a long one, Mr. Nethersole had expended a deal of money in renovating some of the rooms, so as to have them in readiness to receive the bride, and being a collector of curiosities, he had turned some of the handsome and old-fashioned things he had purchased to good account. Amongst these things, he had set up a curious carved mantelpiece in a room which made the corner one at that side of the house. This apartment was entered from the large drawing-room, and there was another door in it that led into the rooms that made the front to the west side of the house, and it was used as a kind of second library, especially by Susan, and called the carved room, on account of several carved treasures collected there. The mantelpiece was, however, its chief ornament and curiosity. This was of foreign workmanship and of great height, so tall that the side panels had not struck me as unusually broad until Susan, touching a spring in one, a door flew open and revealed a recess large enough to admit a full-grown person. It was fitted up with shelves, on which were sundry knick-knacks. Mrs. Nethersole laughed heartily at my surprise. Yes, she said, it is a curious thing. Frank picked it up at a sale at some old house in Cumberland, where it had been brought from abroad, and there it really did communicate by a secret passage between the room in which it was placed and another some distance off. Here, however, not desiring any secret passage, Frank placed it against the outer wall and fitted it up thus, and I call it our skeleton cupboard without the skeleton. She shut the door again and went on to show me the other curiosities in the room, telling me she often wrote her letters there, and that we could now do so together. Very well, together, said I, but not alone as far as I am concerned. There are plenty of cheerful rooms in this delightful house, but this one, if you will let me confess it, strikes me as just a little gloomy with its skeleton cupboard and all. I should get melancholy, if not a little frightened, sitting here alone. Susan Nethersole had one of those simple, unimaginative natures that could not believe there might be a grain of earnestness in my half-jesting speech, and she laughed at me again and again, and made a joke of the whole thing. Her husband coming in at the moment, she repeated my words for his edification. Mr. Nethersole was a great favorite of mine, and no one took a joke quicker, in general, even when aimed at himself or his belongings. Now, however, something, I scarcely know what, in his manner, made me wish Susan had unearthed some other topic than this for his amusement. I thought he seemed taken aback and annoyed when he was informed of the subject of our discourse, and yet so very slightly did he discover this feeling that I doubted whether it was not fancy on my part. At any rate, the joke was soon stopped, and whether or not Susan, like myself, began to perceive that it was unwelcome to her husband, it was not again alluded to until after what I am going to relate had taken place. Miss Daventry arrived in a few days after this, and knew nothing of its occurrence, but not unnaturally I felt in the recesses of my own mind a growing curiosity as to what the effect this, to me, gloomy carved room would have upon her. Rather to my surprise, it took her fancy completely, secret cupboard and all, and, in practical proof that she found it a congenial spot, she spent her mornings always there, either in company with her hostess and me, or alone. She was a reserved girl, a little difficult to get on with at first, but with warm affections beneath her cold manner. By degrees we became very friendly, and all the sooner for possessing a mutual friend in our hostess. But our tastes were not wholly in common in other matters besides the carved room. She was certainly wanting in imagination, but the generosity that led her to magnify the value of this endowment in others might have atoned for worse deficiencies. Our visit had lasted for some weeks, and my aversion for the carved room was a good deal toned down. My story has at least the merit of being quickly told, but, as you will perceive in the account that follows, I can for the most part only give it as related to me by another person. One day Mrs. Daventry sat alone in the carved room engaged in writing. It was a bright spring afternoon, and she enjoyed her occupation, and was fully engrossed by it. Suddenly, something, she knew not what, made her look up, and seated at a table, which she never remembered seeing before, was an elderly man, in a wig and an old-fashioned kind of wrapper or dressing-gown. The door in the panel of the mantelpiece was open, and from it advanced a beautiful young woman, with a cup or phial in her hand. Though she was beautiful, there was a covert expression in her face, either of fear or guilt, which turned its charms into something intangibly evil and alarming. Only a minute was permitted to Miss Daventry to gaze at them, for as the gentleman looked up from his papers to take the phial from the young lady's hand, figures, table, phial, and all vanished, leaving the late spectator as cold as if transplanted to the Arctic snows. She longed to escape from the room, but could not easily subdue the wild beating of her heart, nor summon resolution to pass the spot at which the vision had appeared. To her inexpressible relief, Mr. Nethersole came in from the drawing-room. "Why, what is the matter?" said he, cheerfully. "You look frightened." "Frightened?" she repeated, as if that were too mild a word. "Oh, but I cannot tell you here. Come into the drawing-room, and you shall hear it all. It was heaven itself must have sent you here." She had flown to his side as he entered the room, and even laid her hand upon his arm, in spite of her usual reserve. He caught it in his rather quickly, and although she withdrew it at once, she was somewhat surprised to find herself not allowed to do so easily. It was unlike Mr. Nethersole's usual conduct, which was always gentlemanlike, and annoyed her, and they entered the drawing-room in silence, and stationed themselves at each end of the hearth-rug. "Now, tell me about it," said Mr. Nethersole, and a blessed feeling of reassurance came over Miss Daventry, partly at the warmth of the fire, and partly at the sense of human companionship, and yet she felt, at the same time, a sudden, almost invincible, dislike towards Mr. Nethersole, and a disinclination to tell him the story she had only the moment before been so anxious to pour forth. He spoke again, however, asking for her tale, and excuses seemed to fail her. "I was far from any thought of fear and gloom, and so happy at my writing," she began, and then she related all that has just been told, from the particulars of which she never after deviated. "Oh, tell me what you think about it all," she said, in conclusion, and with her nerves unstrung anew at the silence he had maintained. A dread of coming evil mingled with her recent fear, for, looking at her steadily, he smiled in a peculiar way. She did not like the smile. "Oh, do not smile like that," she said. "I cannot bear to see you do so. It was all only too real and horrible." But still he continued smiling, and into his face and general appearance crept some indefinable change that struck her with dismay. He seemed the same, yet not the same. If she had longed to escape from the carved room more, 10 times more, did she wish to fly from it now? "I know exactly what you saw," he said. "It was real. You are speaking quite truly." She looked at him in amazement, for the taunting smile grew into something mocking and malignant, and there was a fiendish satisfaction in its mirth. Suddenly his whole figure changed before her eyes. His stature shot up visibly, and took gigantic proportions. One moment of stillness, then he advanced towards her, and, with a wild and terrible shriek of despair, she fell senseless on the floor. Mr. and Mrs. Nethersole and I had been in the entrance hall. Miss Daventry had retired in order to finish her writing, saying she would judge of our success on her return, and none of us had left the hall since then, Mr. Nethersole doing the heavier part of the work, and Susan and I judging and deciding as to the various effects. "Dear me," said Susan, at last, "to whom is Laura talking in the drawing-room?" But we all concluded it must be one of the servants gone in there, possibly to attend to the fire, and none of us could tell distinctly after whether we had indeed heard a second voice, or accepted it as a foregone conclusion, knowing that Miss Daventry would scarcely be talking to herself. In a minute or two, however, after Miss Nethersole had spoken, our ears were pierced by that shriek, the most appalling of the kind I have ever heard, and we all three rushed in dismay to the drawing-room. We found Miss Daventry, prostrate and senseless, on the floor. She was carried to bed, and a doctor summoned, but all that night, and for many days after, she was very ill and partially delirious, and it was not until about a week had elapsed that she grew sufficiently composed to be able to tell us what had happened. Poor girl! She never again became really well. For 2 years she was subject to epileptic fits, and at the end of that time she died, regretted by all who knew her. Of course, you may say that, although in apparently good health, the event proved her to have been in an unsound state, and that what she saw was not the cause but the effect of illness. To enable one to decide, a few facts should yet be told about the mantelpiece, revealed by Mr. Nethersole after this affair, and I may as well mention, for as much as it is worth, that the panel door was found really open when we sought in the carved room for some explanation of the state in which Miss Daventry was discovered. There was a story told about it in Cumberland, where, as I said, Mr. Nethersole had bought it at a sale, that it had been conveyed there from Italy by the owner of the house, an elderly gentleman, and he had at the same time brought home a young Italian bride of noted beauty. He was a great naturalist, and although much attached to his young wife, there was as much difference in their tastes as between their ages. An Italian cousin, a former lover of hers, paid them long visits, but it was not until after 10 years of married life had passed that the tragedy was perpetrated. The naturalist used for his study a room that communicated by the panel door with his wife's apartments, and he used to keep by him, as a refreshing drink when at his work, an infusion of herbs prepared from his own recipe. One day he was found sitting, dead, in his study, and the cause of death was discovered to be poison. Contrary to his usual custom, he had left his cup of herb tea unfinished, and its contents, being analyzed, were found to contain poison from a certain deadly narcotic root mixed with the other ingredients. Whether the mischievous herb had entered into his drink by accident or design, there was no one to say. There it undoubtedly was, and although nothing was proved, suspicion pointed darkly at the wife, who came into much wealth at her unfortunate husband's death. She left the country subsequently and married her former lover, and after some vicissitudes, the place in Cumberland came to the auctioneer's hammer, and the mantelpiece came into the possession of Mr. Nethersole. "And much besides, apparently," said Miss Glossop. "Has any good at all befallen the Nethersoles since, or have they all gone mad?" "Not at all," said Mrs. Beverley. "The marriage was a very happy one, and their children and affairs have all flourished." When Mr. Nethersole related the Cumberland story to his wife and me, he had kept it to himself before Miss Daventry's fright, he confessed to having been a good deal startled at the dislike I had taken to the carved room, for after having put up the mantelpiece, he himself had scarcely been able to control an aversion he had felt towards it. Although handsome, the mantelpiece was a gloomy object, and to this fact he had attributed this dislike. He, however, had the cupboard walled in, and the panel itself nailed up, and I have heard no more of it since then, except that the room is not a favorite sitting room, and that recently the panel door was discovered in an unexplained way to be open. The curiosity of some servant or visitor might possibly account for that, but putting that aside, however, and granting the whole of poor Laura Daventry's tale to have happened as she believed, it was an uncomfortable thing for Mr. Nethersole, was it not, that the fiend, or whatever it was, the Italian lover perhaps, should have assumed his appearance? "Most abominably so," said Miss Glossop. "Do you think he felt the matter much?" "More than he cared to confess, I fancy. But, as you may suppose, It was just the sort of affair to get suppressed by general consent, since no good was to be got by talking of it. Said Miss Glossop. I should have had both the door and mantelpiece burnt with a bell, book, and candle, and I will not trouble you to get an invitation to Granton Hall for me. I should never feel comfortable alone with my host. And he himself, I should say, must always have a kind of mistaken identity feeling about him, and a dread of shooting up suddenly and becoming gigantic. And now, a truce to ghost stories for the night, or my going to bed at all will be a farce. The end.